He looked like a kid the room could ignore until he began to speak, and everything they'd decided about him started to crack. They came that morning believing the story was already written. A case on the calendar, routine appearances, a quick sentence, a name crossed off the docket. The courthouse smelled like old paper and impatience. People shuffled into wooden benches and took their assigned positions. Cameras waited like small, hungry birds. At the defendant's table, a young man stood with a calm that didn't match the rumors. Steady hands, a hoodie zipped halfway, eyes that had learned early how to count the distance between a lie and the truth. Eli King, 19, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The prosecutor's opening already had the clipped cadence of something rehearsed 100 times. The chase through the city, the sudden stop, the struggle with officers, the fingerprints found on the steering wheel. It was the sort of sequence that slides like wheels into place. Neat, satisfying, headline ready. That sequence is what many people listened for, and when the prosecutor spoke it, there were nods in the gallery. Judge Harold Mercer sat up on his bench with the gravity of someone whose years had taught him to prize efficiency over complication. Over the rim of his glasses, his expression suggested the case was settled before anyone had taken breath. He had made his mind a small, tidy thing that the calendar approved of. He had a lunch at 1. He had a tennis match at 4. He had no room for a young man's complicated truths. "Mr. King," Judge Mercer said at the outset, his voice a little dry with a laughter he withheld. "You understand the charges against you?" Eli's answer was simple and clear. "Yes, Your Honor." There was a ripple of pity, a quick glance shared among strangers who prefer a neat outcome to the mess of nuance. The prosecutor, Dana Voss, moved as if on cue, precise, glossy, practiced. She painted the story in broad strokes. The Audi reported stolen, officers in pursuit, the defendant allegedly seen driving, fingerprints on the wheel, an attempted flight. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, like a final curtain call. But under those broad strokes there were lines that didn't match up, a detail that sat wrong in Eli's mind like a grain in a lock. He'd watched enough to notice the seams. He'd listened to his mother, Simone King, who'd been a paralegal for 2 decades, returning home with tired hands and sharper stories about police reports, about who gets listed and who gets ignored. He'd spent afternoons not on courtside with friends, but in the library, reading case summaries and municipal codes, learning the beats by which courtroom theater moves. Not to prove something to the world, it was a survival habit, a way to prepare for a world that didn't often prepare itself for people like him. When the prosecutor finished, Judge Mercer called for the defense. Eli's appointed public defender, Mark Ellison, rose with the weight of too many clients in his shoulders. He shuffled papers like a man carrying too many unfinished apologies. He had a voice that belonged to 1,000 other defendants, practiced but exhausted, and for a second the room's pity flexed again into sympathy for the system's strain. Eli laid a hand on Mark's forearm in a quick, measured touch. Mark met his eyes. There was a conversation in the silence. The man will speak, the man will be heard. Mark sat. Eli stood. "I will be representing myself," he said. For a few seconds, the courtroom could not decide how to react. There were gasps and the quick rustle of cameras turning. Judge Mercer's eyebrows rose with amusement. "You will what?" he asked. "I will be defending myself, Your Honor," Eli answered. "No bravado, no flourish. Just certainty that made people shift in their seats." Dana Voss let out a short, incredulous laugh. "This should be interesting." It was interesting in the way a small stone tosses concentric circles across a still pond, subtle at first, then widening until even the shore feels the motion. Eli moved forward. He kept his hands where people could see them. He let a silence grow long enough to unsettle the practiced rhythm of the room. Then he spoke in a clear, fast cadence that left no time for the crowd to manufacture their assumptions. "Your Honor," he said, "before we proceed, I would like to confirm one fact with the prosecution. You called Officer Ramirez as the eyewitness who observed me driving the vehicle. Is that correct?" Voss answered quickly, the sort of automatic response trained by procedure. "Yes, Officer Ramirez observed the defendant behind the wheel, then pursued and apprehended him. And that observation is recorded in Officer Ramirez's patrol report? Of course, Voss said. Then I move to exclude that testimony, unless the court allows verification of Officer Ramirez's location logs for the night in question. The word logs landed like a fresh key in a lock. Judge Mercer squinted. On what basis? Because, Eli said, spinning his words like a wire across a bridge, the officer was off duty at the time the pursuit began. If his report claims a direct eyewitness observation, then his GPS and assignment records should corroborate it. If they do not, we are left with a report that cannot be verified. The courtroom's laughter shrank. The prosecutor's chin tightened. A lawyer who pleaded routine so often that the truth of routine blurred had been nudged into a new position. Defense, you are asking the court to subject the officer to location verification because you claim he wasn't on duty. Voss's voice had steel in it now. Yes, Eli said. If the state insists the officer observed these events personally, then it must allow verification of that claim. Judge Mercer looked over the room like a captain assessing weather. Does the prosecution object to verifying an officer's location records? Voss folded and refolded her papers, searching for purchase on a point that had just shifted ground. No objection, Your Honor, she said finally. But the way she said it carried an undercurrent of restraint, a slow-blown admission that this was a question she'd rather not answer in public. The shift was quiet, but decisive. The gallery's attention narrowed. The laughter evaporated. For the first time, the case did not unfold as a line to be read. It became a problem to be solved. Eli didn't stop. He anticipated the next pivot, the place where prosecutors lean on evidence that sounds objective but often isn't examined in public. Regarding fingerprints, he said, turning to the jury now as though they were an assembly of friends rather than strangers. I don't deny touching that car. I leaned on it. I opened a door because it was unlocked, but touching is not the same as taking. The state wants you to equate presence with guilt. A juror shifted. Someone in the back of the gallery muttered. Voss tried to reframe the narrative. Fingerprints plus flight equals guilt. But Eli had the momentum now. He asked about the lab analysis, and when the courtroom seemed to expect the usual answer, yes. The lab specialist was present to testify. He dropped the detail that would snap the frame of the prosecution's neat picture. Was the forensic analyst who examined the prints subpoenaed to testify? He asked. There was a pause long enough to taste. Voss's lips tightened. No, Your Honor. We submitted the report. So the state is relying on lab conclusions without bringing in the person who did the analysis? With no cross-examination on chain of custody or methodology? Eli's voice came faster now, each sentence a short, sharp fact. You can't challenge what you can't question. He pulled a photocopy from the folder he'd brought and read a sentence that had been filed somewhere in the paperwork stack but forgotten in the telling. The vehicle's owner wrote in the initial report, I left the car running while I grabbed something from the store. A white kid jumped in and drove off. That's what the owner told officers at the scene. The room inhaled in unison. The sentence, plain as an untouched brick, unsettled the architecture of the case. The neat arc of the prosecution's story, black kid, chase, guilt, was suddenly coiled into doubt. Voss rose like someone trying to patch a leaking ship. Mr. King, the defendant was found in possession of the vehicle, she said sharply. He was located nearby after a pursuit and showed signs of resisting arrest. I was found a few blocks from where the car was abandoned, Eli said, each phrase economical as a strike. I had gone to the store with friends. I leaned against that car because it was unlocked. I opened the door out of curiosity. I did not drive it. Officers encountered me and decided proximity was enough. He walked the jury through a simple scenario, the way hands leave traces, the way curiosity sometimes writes signatures that can be misinterpreted as confession. He named the pattern, shortcuts taken in the interest of a fast closure. He spoke of the city's hunger for resolved cases, and how sometimes a person's color fills the gap between suspicion and conviction like a makeshift plug. Judge Mercer's features shifted. The arrogance he'd worn as armor thinned. He had seen cases cleared with deference to reports and habit. He had not expected a defendant to dismantle the architecture of a prosecution's assumptions, the way Eli did, with quiet facts and faster logic. The courtroom, once a theater for prearranged roles, began to rearrange itself around the new possibility that this case might not be what it appeared. There was a moment, a small, electric pause, when the judge asked the prosecution if she had anything further. Voss, who had relied for years on the momentum of appearances, found herself empty-handed for a response that could stand up to the verification Eli demanded. "No, Your Honor," she said at last, voice thin with the strain of being cornered in public. Eli read their faces the way he had read reports in the library. The small hardening at the jaw that comes from realizing tidy narratives were built on sand. He knew what people feared next, the public embarrassment of a rushed assumption exposed, and he kept going. He detailed the chain of events as he remembered them, precise and fast. The trip to the store, the laugh with friends, the idle curiosity that led him to touch a car. He stated the times he arrived and left the store. He named witnesses who would say they'd been with him when he walked away from the scene. He asked the judge to allow verification not as a demand for spectacle, but as a request for the same standard given to those in power. The judge listened, and something in him began to fray. He had believed for a long time that the system was efficient because it was predictable. Eli's questions made it look instead like a series of expectations manufactured by habit and bias. As Eli spoke, the courtroom felt the pressure of something old loosening. Outside, people who rarely think about the mechanics of evidence were suddenly thinking fast. Who had written the officer's report? And had anyone verified where that officer was that night? Why had the lab tech not been called? Why had the owner's initial description been footnoted instead of amplified? When the judge finally leaned forward and spoke, the words were small but heavy. "Counsel," he said, addressing the prosecution, "the court will allow verification of Officer Ramirez's location logs and will review the forensic documents more closely. For now, we will pause." The pause felt like a verdict for the whole system. Reporters scribbled. Phones leaned in. The prosecution, unaccustomed to the light of scrutiny in such an intimate place, blinked. Eli stepped back. He was not triumphant in the way the cameras wanted him to be. He was not craving applause. He was measured, knowing the fight had not yet been won. He only wanted what should be given to any person standing accused, the chance to test assumptions with data. The next days were a small storm. GPS logs came in. Payroll rosters showed that Officer Ramirez had clocked out hours before the chase the report claimed he'd witnessed. The lab technician's notes, when subpoenaed, showed inconsistencies in notation and a chain of custody that left gaps wide enough to drive an investigation through them. The owner's handwritten statement was in the file. It had been overlooked in the rush to present a clean narrative. When the court reconvened, the weight in the room had changed. The prosecution's confidence had been tempered by the evidence of its shortcuts. Eli had not shouted or leaned on rhetoric. He had asked for facts. The judge, who had entered the day expecting a quick clearance of the docket, had watched the case fold upon itself into something larger. He had watched, too, the faces of people who'd been willing to accept a narrative because it fit the world they already knew. "Case dismissed," Judge Mercer said. The words echoed with different meanings across the benches. For some, relief. For others, the sting of a public rebuke. For Eli, the dismissal was not the end, but a hinge. He had not sought spectacle. He had sought truth. He had exercised a voice many in his community don't have the training to use. He had revealed a system that sometimes mistakes speed for justice. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps with the predictable hunger for a quote. Microphones thrust forward like thin weapons. "Did you expect this?" they demanded. "What now?" Eli moved through them like someone traveling with a private thought. He refused the theater. His mother, Simone, wrapped him in a hug that held all the nights she'd said no when the world seemed to suggest only resignation. Her face crumpled with exhausted relief and quiet pride. "You scared me," she said between breaths. "I had to do it," he answered. Someone had to ask. Across the street, Judge Mercer sat watching from his car. The stiffness of his posture had lost some of its armor. His expression carried something that looked like reconsideration. He had not expected this view of his work. He had not planned to be made to see the seams. When Eli caught his eye, the judge gave a small nod and, with a voice muffled by glass, called out the question that would arrive in his chest later. "Ever thought about law school?" Eli's smile was small and private. "I'm already on my way," he said. What this moment revealed, beyond the immediate victory, was not simply that one young man could secure freedom through logic and courage. It was the proof that the system, run by people who live and work and become comfortable with patterns, can be pushed into facing its blind spots when someone refuses to let assumptions stand untested. It was proof that the tools of law can be used by the people they are meant to protect, not only by those who wield them professionally. Eli's path from the courthouse that day did not arc into instant fame or proclamation. He went home to a small apartment where his mother kept a stack of old case notes, a coffee-stained encyclopedia of municipal codes, and a battered legal guide he'd borrowed from a library sale. He signed up for community legal clinics. He studied the way evidence is transformed into narrative. He vowed, quietly and with iron purpose, to be in court as an advocate for people who didn't know how to read the rules of the game. The larger lesson, the kind that sits with you after the last camera has packed away, is not about one judge or one case. It's about how many stories we accept because they are easy, and how few we test because testing takes time and patience. It's about the people who live at the intersection of assumption and action, the ones who are marked guilty by circumstance rather than by proof. If you have ever watched a headline and accepted the story it tells without asking what is missing, this is a reminder to be skeptical. If you have ever heard the police report and nodded, this is an invitation to ask for records. If you have ever felt that the system works smoothly because it seems efficient, remember, efficiency without scrutiny is merely speed. Eli's victory was a small one with a long echo. The court had been made to pause. The officer's account had been checked. The lab's procedures were examined. And one young man had shown a community what can happen when knowledge meets courage. There are many who will never get a chance like Eli did. They do not know the language of evidence. They do not have the time to battle a calendar full of assumptions. That is the heavier truth that clung to the courthouse steps the day the case was dismissed. For every Eli who could demand verification, there are dozens who cannot. This story is not meant to make you feel good. It's meant to make you think and then act. If you believe that justice should be more than a timetable for closure, if you think we should treat evidence with the same suspicion we treat comfortable narratives, then share this story. Talk about it. Ask questions when you hear a report that fits too neatly into a stereotype. Demand records. Demand accountability. Demand the small, boring things that make justice real. Because justice is not just laws printed on a page. It's the work of people who question, who verify, who refuse the easy story. And sometimes, if we are lucky, it will be a young person in a hoodie who teaches us that lesson. If this story made you pause for even a second, share it. Subscribe for more stories that peel back the surface and show the people who live at its edge. Because next time, the person in that chair might not have Eli's voice. They might need you to ask the questions that save them.